Thank you very much for everyone who's come to join us today. And I think it's going to be a really interesting and exciting hour. I'm certainly excited about having this discussion. And today what we're going to be talking about is the potential, the opportunities for AI to make a real difference in the development, the distribution, the deployment of medicines. But we're really going to be focusing on how we can make that happen in a practical way, and how trust is so important in healthcare, in medicines, in order to take that forward. But I'm going to start by introducing you to our august list of speakers. And today I'm really delighted that we've got together people who already have rolled up their sleeves, some for quite so many years, to really start using AI within medicines. So to start with, I'd like to introduce you to Jim Weatherall. Jim is the Vice President and Data Science of AI and R&D at AstraZeneca, and he leads the application of advanced analytics as a way of unlocking the full potential of data through data and text mining, machine learning and artificial intelligence, visual analytics, modeling and simulation. He's driving a transformation in the way medicines are discovered and developed through applications of advanced data science in order to make meaningful difference to the lives of patients around the world. Externally, Jim is a former council member and vice chair of data science section at the Royal Statistical Society in the UK, as well as a founder member of the Cambridge Centre of AI in Medicine. Thank you so much for joining us, Jim. Next, I'd like to introduce you to Yuri Skornik from Trace Labs, where he's the general manager, and he leads the company's key projects deploying Origin Trail-based solutions in collaboration with global partners. He has extensive experience in supply chain management, gained during his 5 years at Deutsche Post DHL, one of the largest logistics providers in the world. And Yuri's expertise covers digitalization, organizational design, logistics, operations, and IT systems implementation. Combining his experience in supply chains and decentralized technologies, Yuri is helping organizations across various industries, including healthcare, making their knowledge assets discoverable, verifiable, and valuable. Thanks so much for joining us. Next, I'd like to introduce Bakul Patel. Bakul is the Senior Director, Global Digital Health Strategy and Regulatory at Google, focused on helping build a unified digital health strategy that is aligned with the global regulatory needs. Mr. Patel's vision for his role at Google is to help realize the potential of digital health that is poised to be a game changer in heralding a new era for healthcare generally. Prior to joining Google, Bakul was Chief Digital Health Officer of Global Strategy and Innovation and Director for Digital Health Center of Excellence at the FDA, providing real thought leadership and shaping responsible regulation for this emerging field. And he's very well known for coining the term software as a medical device, which has become very well used, and building a risk framework for medical device regulators globally. He was also the architect of the software pre-certification pilot program and the framework for artificial intelligence and machine learning based software. Thanks for joining us today. And finally, I'd like to introduce Jeannie Greathouse, who's the Senior Director for Healthcare and Life Sciences at BSI. Jeannie is paving the way for healthy futures through scaling digital trust solutions across the globe. Jeannie is passionate about working with clients and industry partners to develop holistic solutions, strategies, and programs in digital health. She's worked with the medtech and life sciences industries for over 15 years to accelerate client and healthcare ecosystems and innovation, with the goal of improving patients' and consumers' quality of life. So I'm sure you would agree we have an amazing panel today. What we're going to do is each one of us is going to talk for a little while, just sharing with you what our experiences have been. And then we're going to have a sort of fireside chat where we're going to discuss the issues between them. Please, we'd love to have all your questions. They will be coming through, and we'll field them and be able to introduce them into discussion later on. So if you go to your Q&A chat there at any time, you can put in questions there. So I'm going to start, and I probably should have started by introducing myself, which I hadn't done before. So, but I'll do that as I go through my section. So Haroon, if you could bring up the slides, that would be great. So so I'm Nazneen Rahman, and I'm a doctor and a scientist, and my background is that I've spent about 25 years in genomics, right at the sort of transformative edge of that. So data was always a real enabler there, discovering genes and putting them into practice. And I really like that kind of system change of using new knowledge and making real differences for patients and people. I also have another role as non-executive director at AstraZeneca. So I've come to understand a lot more about medicines, how they're made, and the potential opportunities around the whole medicine supply chain to be able to make it medicines more sustainable. And really in this decade, I wanted to really focus my energies on sustainability. So I set up a company called UMaker, and what we do is we build science-based solutions to make healthcare good for us, good for the planet, good for business. So really that triple bottom line, that sustainability angle in its broadest sense, covering both sort of equity and sustainability. And we do two things. We make software, but we also do partnerships, because one of the things that was absolutely key if we're going to have any kind of traction going forward is that we need to have radical collaborations. And so we set up the Sustainable Medicines Partnership. Next slide, please. So the Sustainable Medicine Partnership includes all of the organizations with our speakers today, and is a multi-stakeholder action collaborative of 48 organizations across the whole medicines supply chain. Next slide, please. And what we're doing together is we're running a 4-year program, delivering science-based scalable solutions through integrated projects aligned to our action framework, which we developed over about 18 months. And that framework is aligned to seeing accessible digital information, measuring practical sustainability metrics, reducing wasted medicine scalability, and sharing inspiring examples. And you can learn more about the SMP at our website, umaker.com. Next slide, please. So I haven't got time to go through all of these, what we're doing today, but what I really wanted to just focus is one particular project, which seems sort of humble, but has huge relevance, I think, and has served as a prototypic sort of exemplar for medicine sustainability. And we're going to use that again today. And that's about the humble patient information leaflet. So currently, every medicine box has to have a paper printed information leaflet. There's conservatively about 100 billion of these printed a year. That would be quite something. And that consumes a huge amount of resources. And really, this information leaflets are not working optimally for really anyone. There's plenty of evidence saying that the content is not suiting patients' needs in all sorts of ways. For manufacturers, it's a huge extra cost and all sorts of different issues there. And of course, those resources are sizable on the planet. So it makes one wonder, why is it that we're still so wedded to printed information leaflets in 2023? Next slide, please. And I think it comes down to trust in many ways. And I think that that's why it feels like a really good exemplar for us today. And as we're thinking about how we move forward and use technology. So when we think about the information that we have currently, these printed information leaflets are a really symbolic and important, very tangible way of showing trust across the whole of that ecosystem. Regulators can trust that if that information leaflet is in there, that approved content that they've seen and approved is provided by the manufacturers to every user. Manufacturers have that contract of trust that if they put that printed information in that box, then they have fulfilled all of their responsibilities in that regard. Patients know that if they look at that leaflet, that they know where it's come from, they know that it's approved, they can trust that information. So that symbol of trust is really strong with that printed leaflet. Now, there are many, many different ways in which you can access information on all sorts of things, including on medicines, and we have varying degrees of trust about them. So I think a lot of people we would have, in terms of online search, we have quite a lot of trust around there, particularly if we can see the provenance of it. If it's come from the NHS here, then we think, great. If you go down to social media, again, you can get information about anybody, but I think we would trust that less by and large. And then we come to the new language models, things like ChatGPT. And here, one of the most well-publicized issues around that is the sort of issue of hallucinations. And for those of you who don't know, Geoffrey Hinton is one of the leaders of AI, and he's very much alive and happens to live around the corner, in fact, from me. So, and one of the issues then is, it's not that necessarily that people expect everything to be correct, but they like to know, we need to know what we can trust, what we can't trust. And one of the issues that people have had with the first iteration of these AIs is that the confidence with which one's receiving the so-called hallucinations feels, from the user's perspective, the same as accurate information. So this issue of trust across the board, really, but particularly in healthcare, is really key. Next slide, please. So with respect to information and digital information, what we'd really like to do is have digital inclusion. We want to make sure that people can access the information in the way that they want to. And many people these days would like to access that digitally, and they'd also like to access it in the language that they like. They quite often want it to be read out or be visual in some way rather than having to read it. So what we've been doing in the SMP with our collaborators, including those on the call today, is we've been sort of piloting various things with a dummy product, which we've called Umakerol, one of which is being able to directly access that information from the barcode, being able to do that directly from the phone camera. And then, of course, what we would like to do is be able to have sort of better content that is more tailored to the individual. And later on in the webinar, Yuri is going to tell us, show us a little bit about some of the work that we've been doing in this regard. But what I'd like to move on to first is to how AI can be used to make drug development more sustainable and better. And I'm going to hand over now to Jim to tell us a little bit about how AZ have been using AI in drug development. Next slide, please.
Well, welcome everybody, and thank you, Nazneen, for that introduction and getting everybody warmed up. So as you said, I'd like to think about the whole enterprise of bringing innovative new medicines that make a difference to patients. And I've kind of broken that into 4 blocks for simplicity. And it was a great honor, really, to think about how AI is going to drive sustainability and is today driving sustainability in each of those. So if you think about step 1, right, we're trying to understand disease biology in as much richness and as much depth as we possibly can. It's only when we do that, of course, that we can really understand the causes of disease and healthy states, and then how we might intervene and produce medicines that improve that in some way. An example of what we're doing in the disease biology space is creating massive knowledge graphs of billions of biomedical data points so that we understand disease better. Why is this a sustainable approach? Because you need way fewer wet lab experiments to understand disease biology. You can sort of home in on the area you're interested in much more quickly when you've essentially got AI working to do inference over the world's scientific knowledge at your fingertips. It's also sustainable because it means that the well doesn't run dry so easily. You can go into lots of different biological pathways that maybe you wouldn't have had access to before and find many more disease targets. So it sort of enables you to be much more productive with your bioscience. If we take a look at the second area, because once you've understood biology and the target you want to go after, you're now interested in designing or discovering a molecule or a medicine of some kind that's going to make an intervention and is going to change that disease state, of course. And here we're using AI to help design our molecules. So if I give you an example in synthetic chemistry, we use reinforcement learning. So the same AI techniques that enable a computer to beat humans at chess or Go, we use to kind of, instead of maximize the score in one of those games, we ask it to maximize a score to find us a molecule that's stable and has the right binding affinity, is soluble and has all the characteristics that we want. And you can use it in just the same way. And so that way it kind of gets us to the answer quicker. So again, it's sustainable because you're doing more with less. You're not needing so many chemistry cycles of repeated synthesis and using all those reagents and everything every time, because many of those cycles are now being done in silico. They're not being done in the lab, and the time of our chemists is now freed up to sort of take it through that last mile and really use their knowledge to then make decisions about what we do with that molecule. If we look at the third area, now that we have a candidate medicine, we're now thinking about testing that medicine, making sure it stands up to scrutiny, it has the impact that we think it's going to have in human subjects. And so you come to the clinical trial enterprise, which today can be costly, time consuming. And so there's a lot AI is doing and can do there to really streamline the whole clinical development and clinical trials enterprise. We're already using very advanced modeling to optimize supply chains, to sort of take as much waste out as possible. And indeed, digital devices that allow patients to contribute their data to a trial without having to actually attend the trial site, a clinic or a hospital, and which involves them getting in their car or other kind of transport to do that. So again, sustainable in the sense that it has a greater reach and a lower environmental impact. And if we look at the fourth area, if we've done all the other bits right, we've got our medicine approved, it's available to patients, it then still requires some phases of optimization. Once that medicine's out in the wild and not in the confines of a controlled experiment that is a clinical trial, we discover other things about its characteristics. And AI is a critical tool where we will mine that data and understand how to optimize the outcomes for those patients. So now we've seen the medicine in action, we can further adapt its use, its dosing, which patients it's available to, and better understand those outcomes as well. And again, tools like machine learning enable us to find those patterns in a way that we wouldn't have been able to do otherwise in vast healthcare databases. So again, sustainable because you're getting more health benefit for more quality of life for the same medicine, essentially. And finally, the kind of ribbon around the whole package is that this is built on the right foundations. And when I think of sustainability, I think of a very close partner to that as being ethical behavior and ethical standards. We were one of the first large pharma companies, I think possibly the first, to actually go public on our, so you can find it on our .com page, our position on trustworthy and responsible data and AI with some specific breakdowns and what that means to us and how we follow that in practice. And we apply that to everything we do. So very happy to talk more about this, of course, as we go forward. But for now, back to Nazneen.
Thanks, Jim. That was a fantastic whistle-top tour through that and really focusing those sustainability benefits and sort of triple wins because it's making everything work better. So I'm sure there'll be lots of questions there. I do encourage you to write those in and then we'll discuss those a bit later. For now, I'd like to bring in Yuri, and I believe Yuri is going to show us a little bit of a demo, so that's going to be exciting. Yuri.
Thank you, Nazneen. Let me just quickly pull up the screen. And if I could just get a thumbs up as soon as it's up. Fantastic. Okay. So Nazneen previously mentioned UMakeRoll and the kind of testing and trying out of new developments that we've been doing within the SMP. One of the things was around the product information leaflets. Now imagine you've had that packet of UMakeRoll, you scanned it via a digital link or a data matrix code, and you landed on this interface that essentially enables you to chat with that product information leaflet. It's really a semantic AI powered search based on origin from knowledge assets, which I'll talk a little bit later. But let's say I want to ask what are the side effects of UMakeRoll. All right, so here we get an answer on the possible side effects, and there are two ways that this search essentially works. One is using an extractive method, which is what we're seeing on the screen now, where the AI search essentially pulls out all of the relevant content about the side effects of your make role as it is in the leaflet. The leaflet is represented as a knowledge graph. We'll see that a little bit later, but you get all of it here in one go. So meaning that there's no hallucinations. You get an accurate response because it's not generative. Now we can take it a step further and actually combine now this trusted response that we received and actually combine it with a generative approach or a generative AI system, such as in this case, we'll use OpenAI, so the engine behind ChatGPT, to actually then make things simpler, make them more understandable, more concise. So if I actually switch now from extract to extract and summarize mode of the chat interface, I can actually ask the same question. And I will actually get the response based on that trusted piece that we saw above. So what are the side effects? A complete, comprehensive answer. And I will get a more concise, excuse me, I'll scroll up. So a more concise summary from the generative component that is actually using that as input. And in this case, this is the OpenAI large language model, so the engine behind ChatGPT. Now, why are these things, so we have these two methods, extract, summarize. Why are these things so exciting and why are they so powerful? Is because of the underlying infrastructure that I mentioned before, which are the origin trail knowledge assets. And it doesn't matter which mode we use, either we use the extract or summarize, anything we will ask about this leaflet or about anything else, we will always able to point to where to the knowledge asset where where AI essentially got the answer from or combined the answer from. In this case, this is the knowledge asset that I'll just click and open. And as this loads, knowledge assets are essentially just containers of highly structured data that bring some very powerful characteristics. One of them being ownership, meaning that each knowledge asset is verifiably owned by someone. So in this case, for example, this is a knowledge graph representation in a knowledge asset of that leaflet that we just saw. So very kind of a more technical view, but just to see under the hood. And I can actually see, I can click on the NFT page here, and I can actually see who the owner of this knowledge asset is, because each knowledge asset is represented by an NFT, and that ownership can also be transferred, of course, if that's something that is required. So going back, so I'll just very quickly, I have an overlay of the menu. There we go. The second very powerful characteristic of knowledge assets is discoverability. So because they have unique asset locators, what we call, and they have unique ways of being identified, they can also be connected to different knowledge assets. So in this case, we see the leaflet knowledge asset is actually connected to the product master data. And I can actually click on it and load that knowledge asset. And as we kind of continue to explore this, obviously, connectivity of knowledge assets and discoverability, let me just quickly zoom out, the graph grows. And as the graph grows, that means the more knowledge assets have actually, the more knowledge assets the AI systems that we put on top can use. And the third last characteristic that is equally as important is actually verifiability, which means essentially that we get to verify on blockchain who the owner is, which I already mentioned, who issued it, what is the current state, and what happened to it essentially in its lifetime. So we have all that pack of verifiability, we have ownership, we have discoverability, and this essentially web of connected knowledge assets, which might come from 1, 2, 10, 20 different issuers, and is connected on the origin trail decentralized knowledge graph, then serves as input for or as trusted knowledge foundation for AI systems, as we have seen just before as a sample chat interface. So I'm happy to talk about this more in more details in the discussion, but back to you, Naz.
Thanks, Yuri. And that was a fantastic demonstration and really made it, I think, really tangible for people. And I think when we first met, one of the things that you sort of made known to me that was a bit of a surprise, and I suspect would be a surprise to many people, is just how unconnected the current information is. So you can have the leaflet here, but you don't know what product it's for, or you have the expiry date over here, but you haven't got the information directly connected up. So there's that connectivity in itself is one of the main ways in which we're wanting to drive forward, being able to make supply chains more sustainable and less wasteful. So thank you for that, both that lesson and for this activity showing.
Absolutely.
So we'll be talking a bit more later. And again, I'm sure you've got loads of questions about that. Do let us know. I'd like to bring in now Bakul from Google. I know that Google have been thinking about this both the technical aspects, but also how one can be responsible in this area, and how then one can apply it to areas like healthcare. So it'd be great to hear how you've been thinking about that at Google, Bakul.
Thank you, Naz, and wonderful presentations from Yuri and Jim. I was struck by the thoughtfulness that went into some of the solutions that you guys have sort of built together, and I really loved the message, Naz, that you talked about sustainability and then connecting the dots and pieces of information. From a Google AI perspective, Google has been an AI first company for many years, and we've sort of on this journey of taking what machine learning can do to now to generative AI, and as we're thinking about like how do we sort of responsibly put AI into use. About a few years back, I think it's 2017, we put out a set of AI good practice principles that we want to sort of responsibly use AI. We actually have a team at Google whose job is to think about responsible AI writ large, like for everything that Google does, from search to YouTube to everything that happens at Google. And health specifically is very important, right? We include equity and ethics as part of that calculus of how do we think about responsibly creating AI for users. In health, it becomes ultra important. And I think there's come up with some of the things that we also think about is, what can we do as Google to enable others to sort of make their products better, and what knowledge we put. So I don't know the exact numbers, but Google happens to be one of the companies that publishes a lot in journal articles on AI in health, and that has sort of really struck me. I've been at Google about a year, just over a year, and that has been a phenomenal sort of realization that so much thought process, so much thinking has gone into thinking about responsibly and ethically putting out AI tools for the public to use, just because we have such a large surface, right? Specifically, I'm going to double click on the things that we have done in health. So in health, we orient ourselves in like a couple ways. One is, can we build foundational technologies that can be given to others to sort of accelerate that development? And then two is, what can we do to create practices that others can also follow? And so we publish on those aspects. So I'm going to give you an example on something that we have just recently done. You guys may have heard about MedPalm, which exceeded the passing score for students to taking a medical licensing exam type questions. Is based on US medical examining questions. The fascinating part about MedPalm is a large language model. People were trying to pass that exam for a very long time using large language models, and 6 months ago we broke through, and the MedPalm version 1 gained a 67% passing questions or passed with 67%. In just 6 months later, the score is at 83%. So I think we are at a very interesting point in time where not only thinking about what these tools can do for us in terms of generative AI, but also how do we start measuring if those answers that we're getting Understanding hallucinations can be tweaked, understanding the content can be sort of framed in how the model has been trained, etc. But I think the power of generative AI is to start thinking about how does it interpolate or extrapolate from the data it's learned from, and sort of making sure that it's done right. So with that knowledge, we went. Google researchers went in and sort of created an own rubric for a set of like 12 criteria to compare MedPalm answers with what a clinician would do. And it was interesting to see that version 1, MedPalm was much more succinct, left out a bunch of relevant information, whereas the clinician who answered did not do 100%, but also left out a bunch of relevant information, but also then provided a bit more context to the response. And then, when the model learned more, we were able to compare it to what a clinician would answer, and we found that the MedPalm actually was giving a lot more information in response to the question, versus a clinician was doing just enough for the patients to sort of understand. So I can see this. We can all see this becoming a useful tool that can augment a clinician's sort of practice as one step. But the point I'm trying to make here is, I think without knowing how to measure trustworthiness of these tools and creating new tools, new metrics to sort of understand how do we know traceability, like Yuri said, or discoverability, as Yuri said, might be some important metrics to sort of think about. I think there's a couple other things that, just for example, tone of what the generative AI comes back with is also an important factor. Now, understandably, there's no off-the-shelf metric you can say, oh, compare tone here and this. So we'll have to think about how do we sort of think about moving forward in this field with better metrics, better knowledge sets that can actually help us evaluate what these generative AI tools or AI tools are actually giving us, so people can detect whether to trust or not to trust, because trust is, again, something that users will have to take into account, all those different aspects. So I'm going to leave that conversation for us to just start thinking about what should we think about going forward. How should we think about bringing the knowledge that exists in other areas and bring it to this application space? Because I feel like, at the verge of a completely changing environment, I think it's probably an important conversation to have. So back to you, Nazneen.
Thanks, Bakul. That was really interesting and a useful sort of provocation that will, I'm sure, come up in the discussion. And it was also a really excellent segue through to our last speaker, Jeannie, who has the dubious privilege of really having to think about how you can judge these things and verify them and potentially regulate them and show that they're reaching a particular standard. So we'd love to hear a little bit about how you've been thinking about that and how BSI are sort of approaching that AI landscape.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. It's great to be here with everyone and really interesting and thought-provoking conversation. I think I love to see the topic that, this was coming across just from the standpoint of that building trust piece and how important it is. I think specifically when we look at healthcare, accountability, transparency are integral for building trust. And BSI is really, worked in that area as a global standards provider in partnering with many of you, but the broader ecosystem. And is how, do we approach building trust and looking at that from not just a business improvement aspect, but also for over 100 years, that sole mission of improving safety and quality of lives in the world from that standpoint. When we look at AI, transparency and accountability are key from that standpoint in the wider ecosystem and improving the quality of life of patients, but also building trust amongst the community. And BSI works very closely from that standpoint in convening the wider ecosystem that's needed to build that trust and ensuring that we're gathering the wider community of key stakeholders to understand the challenges that may inhibit, so that we can also not just enable innovation, but build trust for deployment. So how we do that, before a standard comes out, we're known as being a global standard provider. We do that by convening the ecosystem and listening to the broader community, the wider community, and from each perspective, participants' lens from that. So it's industry, it's regulatory bodies, policymakers, research centers, healthcare providers, clinicians, and healthcare service providers. Also managing patient health information, as it's much different managing information management systems and ethically anonymizing that data, but making it usable, we'll say, within AI, but ensuring that the privacy and ethical considerations are being taken into effect. So we include ethical researchers as well as patient advocacy groups. And then, for safe and effective deployment, because it's one thing to have everyone sitting around a table and discussing challenges, but how do we bring this to market and deploy it with acceleration for the ecosystem? We work in different facets from that. It can be guidance documents where we're working with a larger community. It can be deploying a standard or a framework, but also from the standpoint of providing third-party conformity assessment, which we've done as a notified body for AI and medical devices. What's interesting about AI is even when you're talking about a medical device, there are far more considerations that the community is looking at when we look at the wider community and stakeholders. And to reference specifically the EU AI Act, it's been from that standpoint of how do we define the requirements and the risks across the industries, across medical devices, but also the machinery that it, makes a device. So looking at the robotics, the manufacturing, and the machinery, but BSI tries to really sit in the middle of that as an objective third party to listen from the lens of those challenges, but to drive the framework and the standards and the guidance to be deployed effectively within the broader ecosystem as well. So I'll pass that back to you, Nazine, because I'm seeing some. I realize we have some hands coming up as well, and glad to further answer questions as well.
Thanks very much, and I'll bring all of the speakers back onto the to start discussing now. It's so many different things that that were sort of highlighted there. We did center this around trust, but I'd actually like to just start just thinking about that concept of trust and whether that is a good starting point. It's one of those things that if anyone knows what they do and do not trust, and we have as humans quite a sort of instinctive response to that, and it covers both. If you drill down and say, why do you trust it? People will sort of try and bring some evidence to it, but it's often slightly post hoc evidence, I think. And often, certainly I know, I trust things that I'm more familiar with more than things that I'm less familiar with, which may or may not be a good way forward. But particularly, as we've all talked a little bit, we've defined trust as in AI a little bit, whether it's transparency or verifiability. Or do you think that do you think that trust is the useful? We know that everybody has a concept of what trust means to them. Do you think it's a common thing that we can use as a framework? Do you think we can turn it into real metrics that we measure? Or are we being a little bit of a hostage to fortune because of the way we feel as humans that might leave a gap where people are not feeling that we filled that? So a little bit of a slightly philosophical question at the beginning to start us, but I wonder, I'd be really interested to see about that. And maybe I'll come to you, Jim. I think with trust and transparency is such a core aspect of trust when we often think about it. But there are sometimes challenges within business and about confidentiality and thinking around that. So I should imagine when you're thinking about those sorts of things, these kinds of potential issues that you have to think about must come up for discussion.
Yeah, transparency is certainly one aspect to it, right? And the idea is that as humans, that does tend to drive trust. If you, as you say, if you're familiar with something and you understand it better, and it makes one think about very complex, dense models like neural networks and deep learning and so on. And I think that's a really interesting debate, because I don't necessarily agree that the opacity of the box is the key to unlock trust. I think there's lots of devices we use, like this one, for example, which we don't really understand how it all works inside, but we trust it because we're familiar with it, because there's social proof. We see millions of other people use the same thing. We don't all necessarily understand how the circuitry inside works, but I do think it's important how it responds to us, the role it plays in our life, and how the inputs that go into it produce the outputs. And it would be the same in medical decision making, right? Would you have enough confidence in how the data going in yields sensible decisions for our health and well-being coming out the other side? So I think transparency is certainly an aspect, but I tend to stop short of saying every single piece of AI, you need to explain every single node and data point inside it.
And Jeannie, is that the sort of approach that BSI would be having when you're coming to this?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And I think, when we think about building trust and enabling innovation, a piece of that too is somewhat making it not so scary, to make it, put a simple term. And I think there's, a couple aspects of that we've been finding in working in the broader ecosystem and communities is, for clinicians, providers, they want to know that the data is trustworthy, right? It's consistent, it's reproducible, because they're making clinical decisions based upon that. So that comes back to the quality, the quality being in place, the measurements, key metrics that are reproducible from that standpoint, and they can feel trust in that data, but it's quantifiable. Trust has to be quantifiable as well. For patients, or we'll call them healthcare consumers, we're finding there's some uncertainty, scariness of what all is this, when you held up the phone, Jim, if it's a digital therapeutic, or if they're using an app, or if it's a software, having software as a medical device, if it's using AI, it can be a little bit Hollywoodish of what all is it measuring on me, or what is it doing with my data? What's it hearing me, or what else is it monitoring of me? And so it's, from a lot of realms, it's the industry, but it's also helping enable the physicians and the clinicians to be able to have that conversation with the patients, who are really consumers from this standpoint, healthcare consumers, to remove some of that scariness. And how do we do that in healthcare and medical device and pharmaceutical safety, safety, efficacy, and being able to quantify that with the metrics to show the outcomes. That's for BSI. We're finding that a lot, not that we say it, but from our ecosystem of those sitting around the table, to be able, that those are key aspects to help build trust and resiliency within.
So that's sort of part of this journey, of which familiarity, as you say, we are all familiar with our mobiles now, so we don't question it, possibly not enough. But and I was interested, Bakul, when we were talking about that, and Yuri also, about this verifiability and sort of quality. So with your Med Palm, and so I can say this, I am a doctor, so I'm not sure what the truth was. If you get 5 doctors in a room, you'll get 8 answers probably, or so there are lots of different ways of, and obviously it is context dependent, and then there's the whole art of the patient in front of you. So that augmented, I can see, and potentially in terms of safety, there are some elements where it will help us just to make fewer errors. But when you were sort of working out what was right or what wasn't, where you were sort of measuring the sort of benchmarking, was that very straightforward, or do you feel that where the trust should be sitting there might be a bit of a movable feast?
If I may, I think your original question about what is trust, I think is kind of interesting, right? I mean, it's and it's sort of intriguing from the perspective is like you said it, Nazneen, like, we trust what we know, and that makes a lot of sense. I mean, we trust emails to go across the pond and not worry or question how it gets there or what it takes to get there, right? So I think there's a sliding scale in my mind in terms of once knowing what it does, knowing that it actually consistently does what it does, and then we stop questioning how it is done, how it's doing, what it's doing. So I think we are at a point where we just don't know consistently the answers we'll get is the same answers we would get tomorrow or day after or something like that. So I think that's sort of the problem at hand, that we just don't know how, we don't have enough runway behind us to sort of get to that place. So that's one thing. And then you said something else, like what we are familiar with, we trust more, and brands are sort of a proxy for that. And brands, in my mind, are a reflection of the processes that are used to make those products and the techniques that are used. So the quality is there. You're going to get it. So it goes back to this concept of, can you rely on things that the AI gives you and know that is the only answer that you get, even if you asked again? So repeatability is one of the things that sort of matters a lot for us, right, as humans. But I think for the question that we faced was with generative AI is, how do we compare it when there is no such thing as a benchmark that we can just go? Like you said, 5 doctors will give you 10 answers or 8 answers. But at the same time, I think you will probably also see those answers depend on so many other variables in medicine, especially because of the experiences the doctors have, things they think important versus not, or sort of the history of the patient, and so on and so forth. So medicine becomes extremely challenging as opposed to, engineering, for example, where everything is a little bit more deterministic than medicine. And when we start thinking about from that angle, for us, it became, we had to come up with a sort of a mixture of objective and subjective criteria to come up with, can we actually evaluate answers given by generative AI is equal to or slightly better or slightly less better than what a typical doctor would say. And I think you could run a clinical trial and or a study and say, thousands of doctors did this, and we got a mean of that answer compared to this. But that's going to be really difficult because you're talking about language and you're talking about context. So I feel like we will end up spending a little bit more time explaining to users in the next, few years, months, whatever the time frame is, to build how it's being built, what goes on into the process of building it, how it was trained, and that education part will start getting people more familiar, will probably get us there. I don't think we're there yet, but I think that's where we'll take.
Thank you. And we've had a question from the floor, which is, what are the ways the panel feel are the easiest way, it's from a member of the public, way the public can know what are trusted sources of data when we click on health information? Yuri, I want to stress the sort of easiest way. Do you feel the sort of depth of the networks that you're building there and what's there, and how do you think that might be translated going forward so that a member of the public can just see and know that it's come from a trust net? Is that something that you're thinking about at Trace Labs?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question, and absolutely, that's I think at the very core of Origin Trail technology is really, because trust is such a broad concept, right? You can tackle it from 100 different ways, and statistically, you will never get to 100%, right? So how we approach trust and in terms of inputs for AI, be it generative or any other types of AI machines, systems that use data that is stored in knowledge asset, is at least providing transparency and information provenance of what went in, so that you know who provided what piece of information, even though it might be in a web of thousands of interconnected knowledge assets, it might come from 50 different organizations. Now that identity, in the sense of who issued what piece of knowledge, that can be completely verifiable, right? So if a certain identity is adopted by BSI, and BSI publishes or creates knowledge assets and connects them, that is fully verifiable on blockchain, right? So anybody who clicks on it, there is a way to connect those two pieces of the puzzle together and understand, okay, this came from BSI. Now then the question, of course, the next question is, do you trust everything that BSI said? But that's I think more of a reputational thing, because we were talking before, or you mentioned you trust what you know, but we also tend to trust who we know, right? And I think that's where identity and this information provenance plays a huge role. And I don't know if you've seen, by the way, there was a really nice report by McKinsey on impact of generative AI, also focused partially on pharmaceuticals and medicines. And one of the things, it's a huge potential impact. They said, I think it was up to 110 billion annual in pharma and med, and up to another 160 billion annually, I think, in healthcare overall. And one of the key hurdles that they listed there, that they highlighted, was actually what they call explainability, which to me, that's an aspect of trust, right? To say, where does the source data come from? Can we repeat it? What Bakul was saying before, right? Can the results be consistently, so can we get consistent outputs from the inputs that we're getting? And that's kind of the aspect of trust that we focused on mostly, right? And then how and which AI systems actually then use these trusted knowledge assets, this trusted knowledge foundation, can be any AI system, right? Extractive, generative, any type of system at all.
So it seems in some ways that maybe it's not so different going forward, in the sense that there has to be a kind of reductive element to it, because we were already drowning in information, and now we're drowning in even more information. And in some ways that sort of, whether it's a brand or it might be an ISO standard that one's achieved, we're going to rely, people will have to rely on seeing something quite quickly and saying, okay, that's a brand I trust, or that's an accreditation I trust. And then it will be for us underneath that to sort of build out the foundations of what that's encompassing, and perhaps being transparent about when you're seeing that, what that's doing, rather than each individual thing being clicking on there. So I think that's really I think that's going to be sort of key, really. This, and it was a great question, because I think easy is the and I wanted to just ask you, I'd be interested in each of your thoughts about, in some ways, ChatGPT and coming out at that time, I think, has brought this world to millions of people who didn't think it was for them before. They thought it was too techy, and so it's made it easier for a lot of people. But then there are people who are saying, okay, it was a bit too soon, maybe it wasn't as responsible, we can't trust it yet. And I just wondered where you each are on that, and whether you think it was great, it came out early, and sure, there's been some issues and we'll have to deal with them, or whether you thought that loss of trust, and of course it's so hard to gain trust and it's so easy to lose it, and whether we've set ourselves an extra hurdle now by having that trust there. So maybe I'll come to Bakul first on that.
Yeah, thanks, Naz. And I think making it available publicly, the generative AI through ChatGPT, was an interesting move by that organization. I felt like, if it was Google, we would have waited and make it perfect before we actually put it out. But I think that's actually put the entire trust conversation on its head. I feel that there's a portion of community where obviously skeptical, saying it's not ready, and there's a portion of community who are excited about such technologies and made the knowledge about the potential for something like generative AI so much known throughout the world that we already, like, on a first step towards multiple steps of knowing how it can work. So people got to experiment, or getting to experiment with what it is in the raw form. So I feel like that journey was brilliant in some ways, maybe not brilliant for specific applications, but brilliant from a technology sort of trusting perspective. Like I felt that that's sort of the brilliance that happened. Of course, I'll be very scared if such an application was released in medicine or very specific like space application or safety critical world, right? I think, but it was very general, and when you ask any question, you can get any answer. And version 1 had like a lot of flaws, and version 4.5 has gotten better over time, and actually doesn't answer some questions as well. So I think that journey of learning and journey of getting people along and people to use it, so they are coming along in the journey, I felt like was a strategy never used before.
Jim, sadly, we're already running out of time, Olivia, so I'll ask you to have a concise answer. I'd be interested in your viewpoint.
Yeah, concisely. Now, I come down on the positive side as well. I put it this way. I think I would have less trust if I thought all these technologies were being developed behind closed doors by all the tech companies just holding on to everything and none of it ever coming out, whether perfect or not, as you say, Bakul. I would actually trust that less. So I do see the pros and cons of democratizing something so advanced so quickly, but I have more trust because at least it's open, and therefore, to a degree, it can be scrutinized.
And Jeannie, what about you? Would it have helped BSI if it had come out a bit later, or were you happy to be very early on the journey in a very open way?
I think the transparency of the conversation of people, just the broader continual communities in talking about it and people becoming more aware, whether you agree with it or not, is going to help build trust because it's getting socialized. And when it becomes socialized, then people are more curious. It makes it more familiar, and it's easier to take a step towards that. So I think it's, without going into the technical aspects, I think it's good. It's created conversation. We're talking about it. It's getting the broader world more comfortable with this as well.
And Yuri?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with most of what the other panelists said. One thing to add that comes to my mind always is we were already swimming in more on the positive side. It's great, right? It can do a lot of good. It's proven, right, already in the past half a year. Progress in pharmaceuticals, in healthcare, in IT has skyrocketed because of the availability and exponential growth of these things. But on the other hand, you then have downsides such as we were already swimming in the world of misinformation before. Now, so sometimes you don't know what's real. You see some videos, images. You just simply don't know, right? And that's also why we try to focus so much on this verifiability of provenance of source data, if you will, to at least give that piece of transparency, because sometimes it's intentional, sometimes it's not intentional, right? So there was this case with the lawyers that was in the US that was so prominent, right, everywhere, that where they were asking ChatGPT to do research, legal research, and they quoted cases that don't exist, right? Because ChatGPT very confidently put them out there. So those types of things, I think it's very positive. It's great, but we do need to be careful with that. Where does the data come from? Can you trust it? And then I'm sure we'll be on a good path.
So in the spirit of transparency, I should say that there is an ascertainment bias here, because we really wanted to bring people to talk today who are really positive and we're really actively wanting to move forward for making AI trusted. So I would suspect that you could get other people who would have a different viewpoint from us today. But I think what is clear is that this is, I think we believe that this is a journey it's a train that's left the station. So I think in terms of working together to try and make that benefit for healthcare, and like always, healthcare has both opportunities that that no other sector has and challenges that no other sector has. But I certainly have felt, just in pulling together this webinar, felt really inspired, and I certainly feel have more confidence and trust that the people like yourselves that are really working so hard to make the best of this and to realize those benefits. And I think it's uncontroversial that there are huge benefits, and it's our responsibility to try and deliver on those. So I know there were a whole load of questions that we weren't, and they were fantastic. So we should have clearly had a longer webinar, and maybe there'll be a point of when we'll have another conversation about this. But I wanted to thank all of the panelists again, and it's been a great conversation, and thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.